development partners, and my colleagues in Cabinet, guided by Executive Secretary Salvador Medialdea. We took a significant step towards lasting peace with the establishment of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. The administration also maintained an unrelenting campaign against criminality and terrorism. The peace and order we now enjoy must be credited to the work of our security, peace, and defense team, led by Secretary Delfin Lorenzana, Secretary Eduardo Año, Secretary Hermogenes Esperon Jr., and Secretary Carlito Galvez Jr. The enactment of the Ease of Doing Business Act paved the way for improved and efficient delivery of public services. I commend the Department of Trade and Industry, led by Secretary Ramon Lopez, here in front of us, for the efficient implementation of this law, which remarkably increased the competitiveness of the country's business climate. We enacted the Philippine Identification System Act, which brings us closer to the goal of achieving e-governance and greater financial inclusion among our people. The National Economic and Development Authority, led by Secretary Carl Chua, has been working tirelessly to accelerate the rollout of this program and immediately reach as many Filipinos as possible. As of March 23 of this year, a total of 61.3 million individuals nationwide have registered for the national ID. Through this program, the Land Bank of the Philippines has cleared the way for 7.7 million formerly unbanked registrants to be part of the formal banking system. In addition, we fulfilled President Duterte's promise of establishing a bank dedicated to the needs of Filipinos working abroad. The Overseas Filipino Bank is our first branchless, digital-only bank in the country. It now serves overseas Filipinos in 116 countries. To further accelerate financial inclusion and broaden the capital markets, the Bureau of Treasury introduced innovative government securities for small individual investors that can be purchased through digital channels. We also finally implemented the long-dormant Real Estate Investment Trust Act, which has become a powerful financial instrument for the property development sector and small investors. In just 2 years of implementation, the total market capitalization size of the REITs in the country already reached 269.7 billion pesos. Meanwhile, the rice tariffication law was finally achieved after more than 30 years of failed attempts under previous administrations. The law opened up the Philippine rice market and in turn lowered the price of our country's staple food for more than 100 million Filipinos. As a result, rice is no longer the main contributor to our overall inflation rate. The rice tariffication law ensures that farmers benefit directly by providing at least 10 billion pesos each year for mechanization, high-quality seeds, access to credit, and training. Before the law was passed in 2019, the National Food Authority regulated all rice imports, and it was the chief importer of the grain. It received an average of 11 billion pesos a year in tax subsidies. With the rice tariffication, the government has already earned a total of 46.6 billion pesos in rice import tariffs during the first 3 years of implementation. These revenues support the reform and modernization of our agriculture sector. This is a complete reversal of the 11 billion pesos annual average tax subsidies the government provided to NFA every year from 2005 to 2018. The rice tariffication law is just one of the progressive efforts undertaken by the Department of Agriculture, led by Secretary Willie Dar, who's here, to build productivity and enhance the resiliency of our agriculture sector. The Duterte administration decisively passed and implemented the most comprehensive tax reform program ever in this country. This provided robust and recurring revenues that helped expand social services and supported our massive economic investments in modern infrastructure. I would like to point out, however, that the success of the tax reform measures cannot be attributed exclusively to the current efforts. This is the logical continuation of decades of reforms arduously passed by previous administrations. TRAIN, or the Tax Reform for Acceleration and Inclusion Act, reduced personal income given out a 14-month pay every year to our wage earners. Under the law, we imposed excise taxes on sweetened beverages, for which we collect almost 104 million pesos a day. TRAIN likewise mandated the implementation of our first ever nationwide fuel marking program to curb oil smuggling. No past administration increased sin taxes more than once. President Duterte and Congress raised sin taxes 3 times within his term. The excise taxes on tobacco and alcohol products improved funding for the Universal Health Care Program. All in all, TRAIN and other enacted packages of tax reform program enabled the government to raise 504.6 billion pesos in incremental revenues during the first 4 years of implementation. In addition to modernizing our tax policies, the Duterte administration aggressively pushed for the full digitalization of the Bureau of Internal Revenue and the Bureau of Customs. In 2015, only 10% of the country's taxpayers filed their income tax returns online. In 2021, this grew to 99.5%. From the 1.9 million electronic payment transactions made with the Bureau of Internal Revenue in 2015, this number rose to 5.5 million electronic payment transactions last year. These figures are projected to dramatically increase in the coming years as we introduce more digitalization initiatives. Meanwhile, our policy of instilling fiscal discipline among our GOCCs, or government-owned and controlled corporations, allowed us to collect an average of 68.7 billion pesos annually from these firms since we took office. This is more than double the annual average collection of the past administration. Through the bold tax reforms and better tax administration, we were able to raise our revenue efforts to 16.1% of GDP in 2019 from 15.1% in 2015. This was our best performance in more than 2 decades. In 2019, our debt to GDP ratio was at historic low of 39.6% from 42.7% in 2015. The international credit rating agencies recognized us by giving us the best credit ratings ever, ranging from BBB plus to a AAA. As a result, we were able to bring down our borrowing costs and raise bond issuance with very tight spreads in the international market. This high credit rating also spilled over in the low borrowing costs for the private sector. Our Samurai, Panda, Euro, and dollar bonds were all met with strong demand, illustrating the high level of confidence of the international investors in the Philippines. Our robust revenue flow and concessional financing allowed us to sustainably fund the Build, Build, Build program, which is one of the lasting legacies of President Duterte. this administration was able to raise infrastructure spending to above 5% of GDP, double the level recorded by the previous 4 administrations. This would not have been possible without the hard work of our infrastructure implementing agencies led by Secretary Arthur Tugade, former Secretary Mark Villar, Secretary Vince Dizon, and Acting Secretary Roger Mercado. The Philippine railway system is illustrative. After many decades of neglect, the company had only 77 kilometers of rail service by the time the Duterte administration took office. Today, we have 1,209 kilometers of rail service. From only 61 operational stations, this will increase to 208 by the end of this year. In 2016, we had only 224 operational train cars. This has now increased to 1,386. Life is now more comfortable as the Filipinos can now travel more conveniently with an increasingly expansive and efficient railway system. Our fiscal discipline encouraged our development partners to support infrastructure through concessional loans and grants. Since we took office, we sealed 28 highly concessional loan agreements for our flagship infrastructure projects. This includes the country's most ambitious infrastructure undertaking, the Metro Manila Subway Project. With the generous support of Japan, what has once been considered a dream subway is now about to become a reality. Apart from infrastructure, the Duterte administration also invested heavily in social services to boost human capital development. We provided healthcare coverage, housing, unconditional cash transfers, quality jobs, free education in state colleges and universities, and free irrigation water. These programs were all efficiently carried out by the implementing agencies led by Secretaries Leonor Briones, Secretary Rolando Joselito Bautista, Secretary Francisco Duque, Secretary Eduardo Del Rosario, Secretary Silvestre Bello III, and Secretary Bernadette Puyat, and National Irrigation Administrator Ricardo Visaya. I also have to thank the Department of the Budget and Management, first led by Ben Jokno and now led by Officer in Charge Tina Kanda, for ensuring the equitable, prudent, transparent, and accountable allocation and use of public funds for these social services and infrastructure projects. To better serve the needs of the Filipino people, the Duterte administration has infused the largest amount of capital into the Land Bank of the Philippines and the Development Bank of the Philippines compared with the combined amounts under all past administrations. When we assumed office, Land Bank had only 88.7 billion pesos in capital, while DBP had 37.9 billion pesos. By the end of April 2022, Land Bank's capital will now be 230.4 billion pesos, making it the second largest universal bank in the country. DBP's capital will now be 76.9 billion pesos. In particular, Land Bank's image as a big rural bank is far in the rearview mirror. The robust capital infusion reinforced Land Bank's financial strength and allowed it to be an effective partner of the government in advancing its development agenda. The capital is being prudently managed and used to finance projects that are needed by the country, not just in the agriculture sector. Land Bank is also the biggest lender to local government units. Other sectors being supported by the bank include healthcare, education, power generation and distribution, water transportation, and housing, all led by the private sector. These game-changing measures and programs made the Philippines one of the economic leaders in the region, growing over 6% annually. The same reforms helped us gain the financial strength to weather the worst of the COVID-19 crisis. Had we not pursued them on time, the impact of the pandemic would have been worse. Our 2020 GDP would have plunged deeper by 13.3% instead of 9.6%. This just only proves that in any battle or emergency, preparation is always the best strategy. When COVID-19 struck, the Duterte administration moved quickly to protect Filipino lives. The Philippines' direct response to the COVID-19 crisis so far amounted to 3 trillion pesos, equivalent to 15.6% of our GDP. Funding our social protection and economic stimulus measures has been a challenge. But the pandemic found us in a strong financial and fiscal position, ready to protect our citizens. The government collected lower revenues due to the lockdown that slowed down economic activity. At the same time, we needed more money to fund the unexpected cost of the pandemic. Fortunately, we had the fiscal headroom to temporarily increase our deficit to GDP ratio from 3.4% in 2019 to 7.6% in 2020 and 8.6% in 2021. We had set out a clear strategy for financing our deficit. We prioritized domestic borrowings, followed by official development assistance, and then and last, the international capital markets. We determined this plan as the most prudent approach, ensuring sustainability in our debt service. Meanwhile, majority of our budget to procure COVID-19 vaccines for our people was sourced from multilateral banks. We were able to bring together the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank under a joint financing arrangement for the purchase of these life-saving doses. This was the first in the Asia-Pacific region and probably in the world. Our debt-to-GDP ratio increased from a historic low of 39.6% in 2019 to 54.6% in 2020 and 60.5% in 2021. Nevertheless, this ratio remains eminently manageable. The fact that the Philippines was able to maintain all its historic high credit ratings throughout the crisis amidst downgrades among our peers is a testament to our excellent record of prudent spending and fiscal discipline. The disruption brought about by the pandemic is only temporary. Supported by the rebound of revenue collections, our deficit and borrowings will begin to decline for the year. For instance, the national government has started reducing our provisional advance arrangements with the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas from 540 billion pesos to 300 billion pesos. This amount will be totally paid off by June 12 of this year. As the pandemic subsides, the Philippine economy is now well on its way to rapid recovery. Our risk management strategy culminated in a full-year growth of 5.6% in 2021, exceeding target and market expectations. This year, we expect our economy to grow by 7 to 9%. COVID-19 cases are subsiding rapidly, while our vaccination program is proceeding apace. Last year, our revenue collection was already 5% higher than in 2020, signaling a return to robust economic activity. This year, we expect to bring back our revenue collections to pre-pandemic levels. Our merchandise trade and remittances are already above pre-pandemic levels. The Duterte administration marked its final full year with an all-time high record of foreign direct investments amounting to $10.5 billion US. We also continued to gain ground in reducing unemployment. Even as the world has been hard hit by the pandemic, our hard-won reforms bolstered our country's ability to recover and rebuild. The enactment of the CREATE, or the Corporate Recovery and Tax Incentives for Enterprises Act, and amendments to the Retail Trade Liberalization Act, Public Service Act, and the Foreign Investment Act will bring in the high-value investments that our country needs to upskill our workforce and further modernize our economy. Our optimism is, of course, tempered by the uncertainties introduced by the Ukraine conflict. We face a situation that will almost certainly raise inflation levels in all countries. This will be due primarily to the spike in oil and commodity prices. Rest assured, the Duterte administration is closely monitoring developments and is doing its utmost to mitigate the impact of oil and food price increases on our people. This is being done through cash grants for the bottom 50% of the population, as well as fuel subsidy and fuel discount programs for the transportation sector and small farmers and fisherfolk. The election season, on the other hand, will not be an issue. We have a long history of orderly and peaceful transfers of powers. The next administration will inherit many hard-won reforms. They will enter the office with the basic groundwork for rapid growth already in place. We will also transition to them a comprehensive fiscal consolidation plan to bring the economy back to its high growth trajectory. Together, we have to create an economy that can provide sufficient taxes so the government can provide the necessary public goods for the continued prosperity of the Filipino people. Our fiscal consolidation plan will help us achieve this. Rest assured, the Duterte administration will redouble its effort to grow the economy faster in its remaining months in office to fully recover our lost opportunities. We will continue to drive up domestic economic activity by proceeding full steam with our massive Build, Build, Build infrastructure program. Infrastructure investments as a percentage of GDP are targeted to reach 5.9% this year. We will continue modernizing our governance system, strengthening our public health capacity, and investing more in our human capital. We will pursue more reforms that will build a truly broad-based and inclusive financial system fit for the 21st century. We will be more active in implementing climate change actions on the ground. In essence, we will continue working hard until the last hour of our mandate to contribute all that we can to our strong economic resurgence. I would like to end my talk with a famous phrase in Japanese naval history attributed to Admiral Heihachiro Togo. The weather today is fine, but the waves are high. The Philippine economy, our ship, has indeed been sailing through fine weather, but the waves of uncertainty remain owing to external developments. No one expected the pandemic. No country was fully prepared for this public health crisis, but we have successfully managed it. However, the experts say other new variants and pandemics could still break out. The Philippine economy is now recovering strongly, but we have to deal with the volatilities produced by the Ukraine conflict. We must also strengthen the resilience of our communities as we face difficulties proposed by climate change. In our highly integrated world, external events could easily break and imperil our prospects. We have sailed through fine and rough weather, but President Duterte has proven to be a strong and steady captain of the ship. The waves may be high, but the ship of state has been masterfully steered. Thank you.
When the Duterte administration assumed office in 2016, it pursued an ambitious socio-economic reform agenda that secured for the Filipino people some of the boldest and urgently needed economic and fiscal policies that have been held back for decades. Game-changing reforms were pursued to achieve a stronger and more inclusive economy. For too long, many Filipinos could not avail of basic services due to the lack of proper identification. With inclusivity as a top priority of his administration, President Rodrigo Roa Duterte signed into law the Philippine Identification System, or PhilSys Act, in August 2018. Mass registration began in October 2020, with over 60 million Filipinos from 86 provinces registered as of March 2022.
Despite the challenges brought about by the pandemic, we accelerated the registration of the Philippine National ID to give every Filipino a unique and digitalized proof of identity. This will enhance the delivery of government services and promote financial inclusion and digitalization, giving more Filipinos access to opportunities that were previously out of their reach.
In December 2017, President Duterte enacted the Tax Reform for Acceleration and Inclusion, or the TRAIN Law. The law reduced personal income taxes for 99% of Filipino workers, giving them much-needed relief after 20 years of non-adjustment in their tax rates. TRAIN also imposed higher taxes on unhealthy or so-called sin products, thus increasing revenues to fund government social services and infrastructure projects.
Narinig ko nga nung sinabi ng boss ko na napirmahan ng Pangulong Duterte ang TRAIN Law, talagang nagdiwang kami ng pamilya ko kasi yung 3,000 to 4,000 na nawawala sa akin, nakukuha ko na siya, natitake home ko na siya. Nakatulong talaga. Hindi lang yata sa amin, pati sa lahat ng Pilipino.
The rice tariffication is a landmark law that reforms the country's previous dysfunctional rice policy. This was finally achieved after more than 30 years of failed attempts under previous administrations. By allowing the free market to operate, we have significantly increased the supply of rice in the country, and consumers now have wider choices of rice varieties. As a result, rice prices have gone down dramatically from the levels we saw in 2018. Rice price is no longer the main contributor to our overall inflation rate. The tariffs collected from rice importers are earmarked for agricultural modernization programs that directly benefit our farmers.
Red tape has been a common complaint among businesses, often cited among the leading factors that hindered investments. To address this long-standing issue, the Ease of Doing Business Act was signed into law by President Duterte in May 2018. The law streamlines and automates procedures in securing business permits and stipulates maximum processing times for government transactions. The Philippines used to have the highest corporate income tax rate in Southeast Asia. Then came the Corporate Recovery and Tax Incentives for Enterprises, or CREATE Act. With CREATE, the country's corporate income tax rate fell toward the regional average, making the Philippines a more attractive investment destination. CREATE also rationalized the country's problematic fiscal incentive system. Now, tax incentives are performance-based, time-bound, targeted, and transparent. A more efficient incentive system will enable the government to generate more revenues for various development programs.
Over the past 6 years, key reforms were put in place that demonstrated how the administration prioritized the needs of businesses to bring about a healthy economy for the people.
The Duterte administration also implemented a series of sin tax reforms to fund the Universal Healthcare Program. The Duterte administration is the only government in Philippine history that increased excise taxes on sin products 3 times within one presidential term. With all game-changing tax reforms, the government generated more revenues and improved the government's finances. Better finances allowed the government to decisively respond to the COVID-19 crisis while continuing to invest in massive infrastructure projects for post-pandemic economic recovery. All of these were done within the boundaries of fiscal discipline, thus helping the Philippines keep its investment-grade credit ratings even as the world saw a wave of credit rating downgrades throughout the COVID-19 crisis. The Philippines used to underinvest in infrastructure. As a result, the country has had to contend with heavy traffic, poor market access, as well as low investment and low tourist arrivals. In response, President Duterte's Build, Build, Build program ushered in the country's golden age of infrastructure. The current administration's investments in roads, mass transport systems, irrigation and flood control facilities, airports and seaports is twice the average annual spending made by the past two administrations combined.
Metro Manila is bursting at the seams. The traffic problem is unquestionable, as economic costs are pegged at 3.5 billion pesos or roughly $72.17 million US dollars. On top of building new roads, we need to develop new cities where people can live and work and where business can thrive. New Clark City, a resilient and green city, is intended to be a place where people will find everything they need: residential spaces, business spaces, a government complex that will house offices of various agencies, a sports center, schools, hospital, and a lot more, an interconnected city with direct access to an international airport that will connect you to the rest of the world.
The Philippines is blessed with a highly diverse array of tourist attractions and spots. But without the necessary infrastructure, many of these places would be out of reach to our travelers. Thanks to Build, 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 numerous airports, seaports, bridges, and thousands of kilometers of roads have been built or upgraded to make tourist journeys around the country safe, convenient, and fun.
The country's tourism and beautiful destinations are now more than ever easily accessible to local and foreign visitors. Over the past 6 years, we have constructed, developed, and rehabilitated numerous airport projects in Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao so that the riding public could enjoy a more reliable and certainly more convenient travel experience. We have also upgraded many of our airports to have night flight capabilities, which means air travel to various Philippine destinations is now very possible even at sundown.
Build, Build, Build has been a big help to the country's agriculture and fisheries sector. The numerous projects of the infrastructure agencies, including farm-to-market roads, have complemented the programs of the Department of Agriculture in boosting food production in the country.
Policy reforms, massive infrastructure projects, all these are game-changing initiatives. The reform momentum continues even toward the end of the Duterte presidency. Additional vital economic reforms backed by the president and his economic team were recently passed by Congress. Amendments to the Retail Trade Liberalization Act, Foreign Investments Act, and Public Service Act. These reforms will further propel the Philippine economy in its next phases of economic development, consistent with the vision adopted 6 years ago.
The Build, Build, Build program is one of the lasting legacies of President Duterte. The unprecedented level of infrastructure investment was made possible by the tax reforms that have helped the government generate higher revenues over the years. Also, our high credit ratings brought about by the country's strong macroeconomic fundamentals have helped us source financing from domestic and international markets at very favorable terms. This has allowed us to fund massive infrastructure and human capital development projects. We created more employment opportunities and we strengthened the country's investment climate towards a robust, sustainable, and more inclusive economic growth. This is a testament to this administration's commitment to deliver on the promise of a better quality of life for the Filipino people.
And now to discuss the developments in the monetary, external, and financial sectors, let us call on stage Governor Benjamin E. Diokno of the Bangko Sentral na Pilipinas.
Good morning to everyone joining us today here and online. It is my privilege to speak before you in today's Philippine Economic Briefing with the theme 6 years of institutionalizing game-changing reforms and shaping the economy. Over the past 6 years, we have achieved many accomplishments, but face a few serious challenges. In 2020, economies across the globe suffered severe downturns due to the coronavirus pandemic. And this year, just as we were adjusting to the new normal, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the global response present new challenges and uncertainty. But we are optimistic as we see clear signs of recovery. But for this morning, let me first discuss key developments in the BSP's focus areas over the last 6 years, then conclude with our outlook. The BSP remains committed to its mandate of maintaining price and financial stability and a safe, efficient, and inclusive payments and settlement system. At the same time, the BSP maintained a reform-oriented mindset. The COVID-19 pandemic did not deter us from pursuing rather game-changing reforms. In fact, the pandemic had proved to be a catalyst that accelerated many of our reforms, such as digitalization and sustainability in our financial system. On the monetary front, the BSP adopted the interest rate corridor framework in 2016 to strengthen the transmission of changes in monetary policy stance to the rest of the economy. In addition, the inclusion of BSP securities in standard monetary operations provided an additional instrument for managing liquidity in the financial system. In 2019, President Rodrigo Roa Duterte signed Republic Act number 11211, amending the BSP Charter. This granted the BSP the authority to issue its own debt securities. This law embodies measures to align the BSP's operations with international standards and global best practices, thus improving the BSP's corporate viability and enhancing its capability for crafting proactive policies, among others. Another key reform passed to address the impact of the pandemic is the Financial Institutions Transfer Act, or FIST Act. The FIST Act is a preemptive measure to ensure banking sector stability in case of significant spikes in loan defaults. The passage of Republic Act number 11439, or the Act providing for the regulation and organization of Islamic banks, marked an important milestone in the history of Islamic banking in the Philippines. Islamic finance will help attract funds from Islamic investors looking for opportunities to support infrastructure requirements, particularly in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. In line with our efforts to promote greater financial inclusion, the BSP introduced the Basic Deposit Accounts Framework. This enables the account holder to access a wide range of financial services, including savings, credit, insurance, investments, and remittances with limited requirements. As of the second quarter of 2021, the number of basic deposit account holders reached 7.4 million. This brings deposit account ownership to a total of 90.5 million Filipinos. The BSP launched the National Retail Payment System, or the NRPS, which promotes interoperability among payment service providers, allowing for efficient and seamless transactions. The NRPS is a safe, efficient, reliable, and an interoperable retail payment system, and is a critical enabler of our financial inclusion initiatives. The BSP launched the Digital Payments Transformation Roadmap in 2020-2023, charting strategies for an efficient, inclusive, safe, and secure digital payments ecosystem. The roadmap aims to convert at least half of the total volume of retail payments into digital form and onboard 70% of Filipino adults into the formal financial system using payment or transaction accounts by 2023. We are now seeing the fruits of our efforts to capitalize, or rather to digitalize, the country's payment system. As of end 2020, the share of monthly digital payments volume reached 20.1%, slightly exceeding the BSP's target of 20% in 2020, set in 2015. This indicates that the adoption of digital payments remains on track to reach at least 50% mark by 2023. The issuance of the Digital Banking Framework also aims to advance financial inclusion and the adoption and growth of digital financial services in the country. At the end of 2021, the BSP granted digital bank licenses to 6 financial institutions. This is expected to further accelerate the creation of e-money accounts. We also launched the Sustainable Central Banking Program, which aims to foster environmentally responsible and sustainable policies and work practices in our key functions and operations.